I just ran out.
Okay, everybody. Thank you for being here. Those of you who are here, we're going to keep talking about the endocrine system today. So when we left off, we've gone through endocrine function coming from our brain. We talked about the thyroid and parathyroid glands in your neck. We moved down through the chest to the abdomen, where we're now talking about the pancreas. Okay. So we briefly talked about the fact that the pancreas has both an exocrine and endocrine function. So it's making enzymes. That's the exocrine bit. If you're poking the pancreas in lab, you're probably poking mostly parts of the exocrine pancreas. But we also have these little islands inside the pancreas with endocrine function, which is really the most important thing that the pancreas is doing, even though it's physically a small part of the pancreas. Okay. So as we're regulating our bodies with these hormones that are coming from the pancreas, what we're really doing is adjusting how we process fuel, how we process energy, what we're doing with incoming nutrients, what we're doing with glucose, in a way that lets us keep our body running all day long, whether you've recently eaten or not, right? So we're going to be thinking about whether we're taking in energy at any given moment, or whether we're really just spending energy that we consumed earlier in the day. So formally, we're talking about are the absorptive and post-absorptive states. This is what our pancreatic hormones are going to be toggling us between. So in the absorptive state, this is when you're eating stuff or you're recently eating something, you're focused on absorbing things into your cells. So what we're doing is we're taking in energy, and we've got extra energy. So we're going to be putting it into macromolecules. So remember our different types of macromolecules way back months ago at this point, September, right? So we talked about our carbohydrates, our proteins, our lipids, our nucleic acids. We're not going to be storing energy in the form of like DNA, but we are storing it in a lot of the other types of macromolecules. Okay, so we're going to store stuff in macromolecules during the absorptive state. But then later on, at a certain point, we've stored all our extra energy. Okay, but that doesn't mean you're going to just like sit under a rock until you eat again. So we're going to put ourselves into the post. I mean, you're laughing, but like think about what like a snake might do or something, right? Some organisms like aren't all that active during parts of their day, but you are. So we're going to be up, active, doing stuff during the post-absorptive state, right? So we need to use this energy later on, right? Okay. So if we're defining these, we are really defining them based on that energy input, right? So whether we're using more energy or whether we're taking in more energy. So for our absorptive state, what's happening here? We're taking in extra energy, right? So our energy input is greater than our energy output, right? You might be walking and snacking on some chips, right? But you are taking in energy there as you're eating and digesting. Okay, so during the absorptive state, we have lots of energy coming in, which means that presumably a bunch of that energy is going to be in the form of glucose, right? If you're eating anything with any kind of like carbohydrates in it, right, you're probably going to be able to break down or convert those into glucose. That's our primary energy source for cells. They're really good at processing glucose and it's readily available when you're in this absorptive state. Right? So any one of your body cells is going to have plenty of glucose to access and can use that for energy because we have so much. Okay? You're also going to have lots of extra, and you're going to have lots of extra nutrients. You're going to have amino acids. You're going to have little lipids. We're going to take all those other nutrients and we're going to store them. Okay. So in the liver and our muscle, we're going to store stuff in the form of glycogen. So remember that was our big carbohydrate polymer that we use for storage in animal cells. Right? So in a plant, it would be starch. In us, it's glycogen. So we're taking like glucose monomers, linking them all up together to form our glycogen, which is kind of branchy. Okay? And we also have fat cells, right? So adipose tissue, adipose cells are fat cells. We are pulling all our little lipids into our fat cells and storing them as triglycerides. So that was that flag-shaped kind of lipid where we had that glycerol backbone and those 3 fatty acid chains. So we're taking what extra nutrients we have and putting them into that form during our absorptive state. Okay. So this is a map of what's happening if you like flow chart form. Right. So for our absorptive state, right, we are absorbing small nutrients. Right, so we did digest them with our enzymes. We broke them into pieces that we could actually physically get into a cell. All right, so you're going to have some glucose, you're going to have some fatty acids, you're going to have some amino acids. All right, so these are our things that we're taking in general. Right, okay, and here's where they're going. All right, so that glucose, because we have so much of it, we're in the absorptive state, it's going to go pretty much everywhere. And when it goes to most of our body cells, what we're doing is just using it for energy immediately, right? Anything that they're doing, we can use that glucose for ATP, then immediately spend that ATP. When we get to liver and muscle specifically, this is where we see that storage function, right? So one of the things we're doing here in the liver and muscle cells that you wouldn't see happening in other types of cells, right? Like in a skin cell or something, is we're making glycogen. Right, because we have special enzymes that let us do that. And then sticking with the liver, getting rid of the muscle, but now we're thinking about our fat tissue as well, our adipose tissue. Right, we're taking glycerol and fatty acids. Some of that glycerol is being converted from other carbs. That's why this is linked to the glucose as well as to the fatty acids. We're taking that and making triglycerides. So you can make these fats in your liver, you can make these fats in literally fat cells or adipose tissue. So, again, as you can see, the liver does tons of stuff. The liver can also turn amino acids into some fatty acids. It has a lot of ability to convert and modify molecules just in general. All right, so for taking in little bits of proteins, the liver is also probably going to try to make that into fat. But your muscle cells, we'll be taking those amino acids in and hopefully building some larger proteins, right? Like maybe we're growing our muscle fibers using those amino acids in a muscle cell. But in general, what we're focusing on here is storage, taking these smaller nutrients, these monomers, and building them into large molecules. Now, wait a couple hours. You're going to move into the post-absorptive state. Right. So at this point, it's been a while since you've taken in any form of energy. Right. So you're getting kind of depleted here. You're not pulling in energy. We don't have much energy input. You're going to have a greater output, right? At a minimum, you're probably still thinking, whatever you're thinking about, but you're also likely still moving around, right? We're still doing stuff. We still need ATP. Your cells still need that. But now we're working with a system where you don't have a ton of nutrients like swimming around in your blood. Right? So we're going to need to be a little more careful in how we use these nutrients. So specifically, the glucose, right? In our absorptive state, it was everywhere. We could use it in any cell we wanted. But when we have kind of low energy in our body, we want to keep all that glucose for our nervous system. The nervous system is picky about what form of energy it wants to use. It really likes glucose. It'll accept some ketones, but that's kind of it. Okay. So we're going to do glucose sparing when we're in the post-absorptive state. Any glucose that is in your bloodstream, we're going to send it to your nerves, right? We're going to send it to the brain in particular. Okay. Other tissues elsewhere in your body are able to use fat a lot better. We can use fatty acids to make lots of ATP, right? We talked very briefly about beta oxidation at the end of our metabolism unit. That was where we broke up those fatty acids in like blocks of 2 carbons, 1 by 1, and made a lot of energy from that stored fat molecule, from that stored triglyceride. Right, so that can happen in cells that like aren't in your brain, but your nerves are going to be doing that. They're not very good at that. They don't have the machinery for that. So we're keeping glucose for the nervous system, and other cells are using fatty acids. And in general, anything that we stored during the absorptive state, right? So triglyceride, glycogen, even protein. Right now is the time that if we need to, we can break them down and use them for energy. Right. So when we're in the post-absorptive state, you want to be thinking about pulling everything apart for energy. Now here's a map of that, right? So what we're doing, right, is we're taking those stored macromolecules. So we're thinking about the glycogen, we're thinking about our triglycerides, we're thinking about proteins, and we're going to be pulling apart different parts of your body. We're going to be focusing on different macromolecules, right? So muscle and some other cells are going to have proteins in them, right? You can see the muscle also has glycogen, so we'll come back to the glycogen part. But we're going to think about the proteins in muscle first, right? So proteins, we know, are just a polymer, right? It's a polypeptide made of a bunch of amino acids linked together. So we're going to pull apart those amino acids, and they are going to go into your bloodstream and head to tissue that's not nervous tissue, right? So not to your brain, not to nerve, but anywhere else, we can take those amino acids and make some ATP from them. We have cellular machinery for that. The fats that you've stored in your adipose tissue, so these triglycerides, we're going to pull apart. So we're going to take the glycerol backbone off, and we're going to then end up with our fatty acids separate. Right, so we can take those fatty acids into the blood and again into any non-nervous tissue and use that for energy. And then we're going to think about some of the things that the liver is doing. So again, the liver can do all kinds of stuff. Right, so the liver is going to be taking some of those fatty acids. The liver is going to be involved with glucose, partially that it's getting from glycerol from the triglyceride, partially that it's getting from its glycogen. Right, so the liver can do lots of stuff. But the same kind of big picture thing is whether we're pulling apart glycogen, right, to make glucose, whether we're taking glycerol and converting it to glucose, or we're taking a fatty acid and breaking it apart and transforming it into a ketone, right? We're still thinking about breaking stuff down. Right? So this is still going to go into your bloodstream. And the glucose we know, any glucose we have, is going to go specifically to your nervous tissue. Right? So this is going to your brain and your nerves, that glucose. And the ketones, they go both places. So ketones are okay for nervous tissue to use. They can process those. So some of those ketones that we made from fatty acids will go to nervous tissue, and some of those ketones will go to the rest of your body. We're not saving all the ketones just for the brain the way we're saving all the glucose for the brain. Okay, so ketones will just kind of go everywhere. So the glycogen that's being broken down in your muscle goes through some intermediate steps. So it walks through lactate and pyruvate, but ultimately becomes glucose, just like the glycogen stored in the liver does. Again, anytime we see glucose in the post-absorptive state, we're saving it for your nervous system. Okay. So this is what we want to do, right? When we have extra energy, we want to store it. When we're low on energy, we want to break down those stores and use them. And this is what our pancreatic hormones are helping to regulate, right? They're going to tell your cells, tell your body, what should we be doing right now? How should we be processing these molecules? How should we be handling our energy reserves? Okay. So in general, like always, no, this is gonna be an always, not an in general. So you're gonna associate insulin with the absorptive state, and you're gonna associate glucagon with the post-absorptive state. Okay? So they have opposite effects. Anything that happens when we've got insulin going around, the opposite thing is gonna happen when we've got glucagon going around. Okay? They're antagonistic hormones, right? So we're going back and forth between them as we go back and forth between the absorptive and the post-absorptive state. Okay. So when you're eating food, you're going to want to start producing insulin to help us with all these absorptive state storage actions. And then later on, we're going to want to start producing glucagon to tell ourselves, now's the time to start breaking stuff down. Now's the time to save glucose for our nervous system. There are other hormones and nervous system pieces that do play into this as well. So epinephrine and the sympathetic nervous system can play a role a little bit, but it's really mainly a story about insulin and glucagon. So let's predict what's going to happen. Whoop, that's that organ. And that's the organ. We're going to be predicting which of these things is going to happen when we are secreting insulin. So what condition are we looking at when we start secreting insulin? Okay. When are we making our insulin? Great. Yeah. So you're going to produce insulin. You're going to be increasing how much insulin you're producing during this absorptive state. So this happens like right after you eat, right? We need the food to get down to the stomach, get down to the intestines and be processed in order to absorb it. So it's not going to happen the instant a piece of food touches your tongue. But right after, when we have all this energy starting to come into your digestive system and get processed, we want to go into the absorptive state. So we're going to be secreting our insulin. Later on is when we're going to want to start secreting glucagon for our post-absorptive state, when it's been a while since we took in any energy. So let's zoom in on insulin specifically. Right? So insulin, probably the more famous, definitely more famous of these two hormones, right? Because insulin plays such a big role in diabetes, which is a fairly common condition, especially since there are different types, right? And the reason diabetes is a problem for people is because it changes how you process or don't process glucose, right? How you're going to be able to take that into cells, how you use that for energy. Okay, so insulin is coming from our beta cells, right? So here are our beta cells. So we're in the pancreas. We've zoomed in on the endocrine parts and these islets of Langerhans. Now we're specifically going to a beta cell, okay? So that beta cell is going to be making the insulin, okay? And the insulin is our signal for basically all types of anabolic actions. So anabolic anabolism is that type of metabolic action where we're building molecules larger, right? We're taking monomers, linking them together into these polymers, and doing this storage stuff, right? So anabolic, right? So we are synthesizing glycogen and triglycerides in particular, right? So when we think about what does insulin do and what are our main ways that we're storing energy, right? It's mainly the glycogen and the triglycerides in the fat, although we know that protein plays kind of a side role, right? So insulin doing the glycogen and the triglyceride synthesis, okay? And insulin is also telling our other cells that in general, it's okay to use glucose now for all your different processes, right? You can be breaking down glucose for ATP. We've got extra. And that is that insulin is going to increase glucose uptake by cells as well, right? So it's going to make cells better at pulling our glucose in, right? So we can use glucose in all these body cells because we have enough glucose in those cells to use, right? So any catabolic processes, metabolism, breaking stuff down, right, pulling stuff apart, insulin is going to start turning off those processes, right? We're going to see a decrease in catabolism when we're in the absorptive state, when we're producing all this insulin. Okay. Right. So we're increasing our insulin secretion during the absorptive state. We're ramping this up so that your body knows what to do, right? So we've got some triggers for this, right? So your beta cells in the pancreas know to produce insulin because what we're noticing, right? We ate food, we digested it, we started to absorb it across our intestinal lining. When you absorb food across your intestinal lining, first place it goes into the blood, right? Yeah, unless it's backwards. But first place it goes into the blood, okay? So right after digestion and absorption, what this means is we've got lots of glucose in the blood, right? So you have these high blood glucose levels. We want to start using glucose. We want to start storing stuff. We want to tell all the cells, hey, we've got so much glucose, you can use this for energy, right? So that's what the beta cells are noticing. And they're producing insulin, the hormone, as a signal to tell all the rest of the body this. So when you see an increase in glucose in the plasma, that's how we know to produce insulin. And I'm over-explaining this and emphasizing this because we are going to want to focus on and notice like the fact that in order to know to produce insulin, we see an increase in glucose plasma, but once insulin is working and we're starting to pull in extra glucose into all our cells, after this has been happening for a while, right, you're going to see a drop in the glucose plasma. So you want to focus on what part of the body you're actually focusing on. You want to think about, okay, are we talking about what's happening in the blood or are we thinking about what's happening in a cell? Because there's a trade-off. Either the glucose is in your blood or it has gotten into a cell. So another trigger is going to be amino acids in the plasma. Again, this is just a product of digestion. That's one of the things we're absorbing across our intestinal lining. Another thing is going to be going on while you are headed into this absorptive state and producing insulin is that your parasympathetic nervous system is going to be activated. And the parasympathetics are that rest and digest part of the nervous system. So part of this digestive process is this part of the nervous system kind of upregulated, right? It's more active than your sympathetics are at this point in time. Sympathetics are the fight or flight. Fight or flight is not supposed to be active when you're full and happy when you're absorbing food. We also have glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, GIP, another signaling molecule kind of from your gut when you are eating, when you're absorbing all these nutrients. So this is another kind of signaling molecule that plays in and tells the pancreas, those beta cells, to produce insulin. So as we shift to the post-absorptive state, we're going to see a decrease in our insulin production because we want to start trading off. We don't want insulin, we want glucagon instead in order to go into our post-absorptive state. So that's going to be opposite to the absorptive state. So now instead of having our parasympathetic nervous system active, right, as we go into the post-absorptive state, we're going to think about the sympathetic nervous system being more active than our parasympathetic. So that's kind of a trigger for this. And also epinephrine, right? So epinephrine coming from our adrenal glands, right? Linked in with the sympathetic nervous system. It's another hormone, got it in our bloodstream, right? That's when you are going to be starting to send energy rather than take it in. So flow chart wise, we've got our beta cells in the pancreas. They start secreting insulin. And here we have our formal terms for everything that's happening. So just generally in tissues, we're pulling glucose into the cells. We are pulling in amino acids. We are pulling in, we're pulling in amino acids to make proteins, right? And any protein breakdown that we were doing, we're stopping it. So pay attention to that little arrow to the left of the word. Okay. In our adipose tissue, we are pulling in fatty acids and we're making triglycerides. And any breakdown of fat that we were doing, so lipolysis, we're going to stop that because we're focused on making bigger fats, right? In liver and muscle, we're making our glycogen, which means we are going to not be breaking down glycogen. We're not going to be doing the glycogenolysis, right? Because there'd be no point to be making it and breaking it at the same time, right? That would get you to net zero, right? So you don't want to be doing opposite processes at once. So in the liver, you're also pulling in fatty acids and making triglycerides. And at this point, because we have glucose coming into our body, we're absorbing it, right? We don't need to make new glucose anymore. So we're not going to do gluconeogenesis in response to insulin because we've got readily available glucose. Okay. The absorptive state, insulin, pulling stuff in, associated with our parasympathetic nervous system, and in general, letting us store extra energy for later. Okay. Glucagon, the opposite, post-absorptive state, coming from a different type of cell, right? Our alpha cells. So still in the pancreas, still in those islets of Langerhans, just a different cell, right? Glucagon is going to tell us we're not storing molecules anymore. Now we're breaking stuff down and we're saving any free glucose for our nervous system. Okay. So our actions of glucagon are to promote that glucose sparing. They are to mobilize our energy stores. So this is a catabolic hormone. We're breaking things down. And what are we breaking down? We are breaking down glycogen. So glycogenolysis, lysis is breaking stuff apart. We're breaking apart lipids, so lipolysis, lipolysis, breaking down lipids. And the one extra thing that we might note here, one thing we will make is glucose, right? So we're saving glucose for the nervous system. We don't have all that much glucose available to us. It's been a while since we actually absorbed any. So the liver is going to help us make new glucose. So that's our gluconeogenesis. And so glucose isn't a storage molecule, right? So that's separate than making these macromolecules that we're storing during the absorptive state. Glucose is basically ready energy for your cells, right? So gluconeogenesis is okay here. So this is an antagonistic hormone to insulin, does the opposite effect. All right. Just checking that we're all awake. So which organ system was it that really, really needs the glucose? I almost exclusively relying on glucose for energy production. Eating carbs is important. We've got a backup method, but this is what your brain wants. Oh, sorry. I guess I just said it. Pick the right answer now. All right, I got ahead of myself. Yeah, it's your nervous system. Yeah, your nervous system likes a quick shot of energy, likes glucose. This is going to help it have energy as fast as possible, right? If you're on a diet, if you're on the keto diet, it can use a ketone, but it wants glucose. Okay? So glucagon secretion is increasing during our post-absorptive state. Right? So during this post-absorptive state, right, we are moving from parasympathetic rest and digest to our sympathetic sort of fight or flight general type action, even if you're not actually fighting or fleeing. Okay? And because our sympathetic nervous system is active, that also means that we're producing epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. Okay? And we weren't making much glucagon during our absorptive state because it's antagonistic to those effects of insulin. It does the opposite stuff. Right? So decreases during our absorptive state. Okay? And the way we know to stop making our glucagon, right, to stop sparing glucose for our nervous system, to stop breaking down fats and glycogen and all that good stuff, is that we're also sensitive to our blood sugar levels, right? So we're going to notice if we start to get lots of glucose in the plasma, right, our blood sugar is starting to spike. This means now we have ready glucose. We don't need to save it for the nervous system if there's lots of it in the plasma, right? So that's going to trigger this decrease in glucagon secretion along with these sort of along with the parasympathetics. But that's going to come along a little bit later. The first thing we're really going to notice is these changing glucose levels. All right, your glucagon is low tract form coming from those alpha cells in the pancreas. Right? It is signaling to the body and signaling a lot to the liver and your adipose tissue, to the fats. Right? And what it's saying is start breaking stuff down. Right? So we see that what we're doing now is we are breaking apart our glycogen, right? And so we're not making glycogen, right? Because that would cancel out our effect. We are making new glucose, gluconeogenesis. We're going to make some ketones. So you should think of ketones as kind of a breakdown product of like breaking down amino acids, fatty acids, that kind of thing. Right. So when we make ketones, even though it has the word synthesis, this is still kind of a catabolic process. Okay. We're going to break down proteins. And we don't need to make proteins anymore because what would be the point of breaking them down and making them at the same time? Okay. In the fat tissue, in the adipose tissue, we're breaking down lipids that we have stored there. And again, we're not going to make our triglycerides anymore at this point because we're focused on breaking them down. All right. So now we're going to do a couple of questions in a row. Okay. Oops. I think. Invalid. Oh no. Okay, we will go through these next time, the whole flow. Yeah, I'll make them work next time. We can do that part as a review. And we can talk more about the blood glucose at this point. Correct. So we do have our basic workflow down, hopefully, right? So absorptive state, you've got initially glucose being absorbed across your intestines. We initially see this high blood glucose level that triggers your beta cells to produce insulin. Insulin runs around your body, telling everybody, pulling glucose, make macromolecules. When we have our drops in glucose, right, this is a signal to your pancreas that it's been a while since you absorbed stuff. So at that point, we're going to switch into our post-absorptive state, and we are going to make glucagon, telling all our cells it's time to break down our stored energy, break down all those macromolecules, and make any new glucose if you can, because our nervous system needs it. Okay. So these are essentially negative feedback controls on blood glucose levels, in addition to being helpful for telling your body how it should work, right? So blood glucose is something that you are maintaining through homeostasis, right? That's one of our regulated variables. We want to keep blood glucose relatively constant, right? If we are either really high or really low in terms of our blood glucose, that's a problem, okay? So our normal blood glucose levels, we got a little give to them, right? A little bit of a range, but normal blood glucose should be between 70 and about 110 milligrams per deciliter. As long as we're in that range, we got good normal function. Now, if we are either too high or too low, we've got terms for this, right? So hyperglycemia, right? That gly in the middle should be telling you sugar. Actually, let's do this separately, yeah. So this gly part is for the sugar, and then emia is blood, actually. So too much sugar in the blood is if you're over about 140 milligrams per deciliter. That's where we define that, right? So this means you didn't pull that sugar into your cells, right? That's the problem here. Right? Versus hypoglycemia, if you're too low, right? Hypoglycemia, too little sugar in the blood, right? This means you pulled too much or you didn't eat enough sugar, right? This may also be the problem, right? Or you didn't make enough new glucose. So this is a problem when you have too low sugar here. So we should be managing this by switching between insulin and glucagon, right? We should be not getting too high because we're pulling in extra glucose using our insulin in the absorptive state. When we get too low, glucagon should be saying, hey, let's tell the liver to make some new glucose, do that gluconeogenesis step, so that we can keep feeding the nervous system, okay? So we should have this trade-off here. And if it doesn't work, we may end up in either of these states. In your daily life, you'll probably notice being low more than you would notice being high, right? Hypoglycemia, you're gonna feel essentially like a little woozy, right? Because we don't have that glucose, we don't have that energy for the nervous system. But hyperglycemia is also a problem, kind of a longer term problem for your body. Hyperglycemia can go on for long periods of time, but it does damage your cells over time. So it can damage tissues, it can damage organ systems, but you might not notice that your glucose is too high unless you get a blood test, right? So this is something you would be checking for sure if you have diabetes, but you might check it if they're testing you for this at a checkup, right? So this is a problem, but it's more of a long-term problem, depending on exactly how. Okay. So if we're thinking about focusing in on that glucose, right? Focusing in on our blood sugar, right? So we should be seeing blood sugar goes up. We want to make our insulin, right? Which means cells will pull in our glucose, move into the cells. When it moves into liver and muscle in particular, we're going to take extra glucose and make glycogen, right? And overall, the effect is that we have a drop in the blood glucose levels, right? Because we pulled it into cells and we stored it, right? So also a factor here for lowering glucose levels. So things that could have been making it high potentially would be if we'd been breaking down a lot of glycogen, right? So we're not going to do that when we have insulin. Or we might have been making new glucose, gluconeogenesis, right? We should be doing that during the post-absorptive state, right? But we don't need to do that when we have high glucose levels, when we have this insulin. Okay. So this is a negative feedback loop, right? Once we pull our glucose back down to normal, right? This should turn off the signal, right? So we should stop seeing high plasma glucose. Once insulin has done its job, it should drop back down. And then we're not going to need to make insulin anymore, right? We're not going to make insulin. Once it gets low, we're supposed to start producing glucagon instead, so we can pull it back up. Which is what's happening in this figure. Okay. So once our plasma glucose is low, right, that's a trigger for our pancreas, those alpha cells, to make glucagon. Our goal is to keep glucose for our nervous system and to, in general, increase plasma glucose if we're below this regulated range, right? So we're going to be making new glucose in the liver, our gluconeogenesis, right? So making it from other types of molecules, which is why we have a separate term for pulling apart our glycogen and freeing the glucose that's in it. So our glycogenolysis is also going to be putting glucose into the bloodstream. Right? And in our adipose tissue, we're sparing glucose for our nervous system, and we are making sure then that we have fatty acids in the blood that the rest of the body can use, right? Because parts of our body that are not in the nervous system can use fatty acids, do that beta oxidation, use those for energy. So that's how this is linked into the glucose stuff. Right? So once our glucose levels are back to normal, we turn all this off, hence it's a negative feedback loop. So as you're walking through, you want to be able to describe what is happening generally during the absorptive and post-absorptive states. You want to be able to link that up to our two hormones, insulin and glucagon. You want to know where they're coming from. You want to know what they're doing. And we'd like to link it up to some of this autonomic nervous system we talked about earlier in our unit. So we want to know that that links up to our sympathetic nervous system a little bit in particular, okay, as we're moving into our post-absorptive state. Okay. And we got some terms that we're going to make sure we can define. So these bullet points or questions are in your textbook as well. Those are pretty much the hormones that we're going to be covering in this brief overview of the endocrine system. There are lots more, but these are the big players, right? So here we have a table going over our primary endocrine organs and some of the hormones that we talked about, right? So we can break our study of the endocrine system out through where do hormones come from, what do they do, how do they interplay with each other? Okay. So this is another way that you can kind of study or use this to make flashcards as you're going through this unit. Okay. And we particularly have a focus on hormones that affect metabolism, so affect energy use, right? So insulin and glucagon we've just been talking about, right? So those are big players, right? But we do have metabolic effects from other hormones as well, right? We talked about thyroid hormones and how they affect metabolism. We've got some metabolic effects from cortisol that we talked about. Growth hormone and epinephrine are also going to play some role here as well. I think insulin and glucagon are the main ones you want to focus on for metabolic effects, but we did talk about thyroid and cortisol in depth, so you do want to be able to understand their general pathways and what's going on. Okay. We're going to do a brief intro to the somatic nervous system. So we're going to skip this question, although I will ask you this at the beginning of Monday. Okay. I'm just going to give you context for where we'll be when we start out next week. Okay. So what we've talked about so far, right? We talked about central nervous system and how neurons work in our last unit. So we know how neurons work. And now we're focusing on different branches of the nervous system, different kind of functions, different types of nerves have as we go out of the central nervous system into the rest of the body, into our peripheral nervous system. Right, so we looked at this figure before, seeing that we have efferent and afferent nerves. The efferent ones are our motor commands. So ultimately, from our efferent nerves, this motor part of the nervous system, we're going to various effector organs. We're trying to have some type of effect on the body. Afferent nerves are all sensory, coming in, telling the brain stuff. And we talked about the autonomic nervous system already. So this kind of secret part of the nervous system, this automatic part that's really involved in homeostasis. And we went through all sorts of stuff related to our parasympathetics and our sympathetics. And we hopefully remember that their targets, their effector organs, are smooth muscle, our cardiac muscle, and our glands. So what we're moving into next is we are going to start talking about skeletal muscle and contraction. So we're going to think first about how do you actually signal to skeletal muscle, right? Like if you want to lift something, if you want to bend your arm, what kind of nerve is that going to be? How does a signal get from your brain out to the body for this voluntary type of muscle? So skeletal muscle is different than smooth muscle and cardiac muscle in part because you do it on purpose. Right? You know you want to contract it and you can have an actual voluntary effect here. So we're going to see some similarities between our somatic nerves, but we're also going to see some differences. In particular, we're going to be focusing on, instead of focusing usually on our synapses and ganglions, as we were in the parasympathetics and sympathetics, we're going to spend a fair amount of time zooming in to the point where our somatic nerves come in and touch skeletal muscle, because we're going to be focusing on how the action potential kind of passes from our nervous system into our skeletal muscle. Okay. So if you're looking for something to peek through over the weekend, I would recommend looking at something like this figure and just, you don't have to memorize it. We're going to talk through all of it, but some of these terms would be helpful to be vaguely familiar with.